The Empathy Table is an Ideos podcast. We believe empathy can shape and influence the ideas for solving some of our world's greatest challenges. Both ideas and empathy begin with a story, and stories are often shared around a table. Pull up a chair. Welcome to the table.
Welcome to the second episode of our Food for Thought series, a special edition of the Empathy Table, a forum and video podcast that brings together Christian leaders, practitioners, and experts in conversation with one primary goal: to build empathy and connection through the sharing of stories and ideas for solving some of our most challenging and polarizing issues. I am Ideos President, Christy Vines. I am honored to be joined today by three powerful women in conversation around co-creation and a future post-COVID-19 that makes space for and takes care of the most vulnerable among us. I hope you'll enjoy this second episode of the Empathy Table Forum.
Joining me this morning is Diana Oestreich, Key Relationships Officer at Preemptive Love, a global relief organization working to end war by providing emergency relief and jobs for refugees in Iraq, Syria, Mexico, and Venezuela. Good morning, Diana.
Good morning, Christy. So great to be here with you.
Well, great to have you here. I'm looking forward to our continued conversation. And next with us is Cheryl Cuthbertson, Director of Engagement and Sustainable Practices at Children of the Nations, where she oversees projects in Africa and the Caribbean, including designing and facilitating the implementation of business practices to interrupt poverty. Good morning, Cheryl. I think we're having audio issues with Cheryl, so we'll go ahead and join in Jamie next. So finally, we have Jamie Haft, Executive Director of Circles USA, a nonprofit organization focused on ending poverty and building thriving communities. Good morning, Jamie.
Good morning.
Glad you could be here with us. Cheryl, are you now with us?
I am.
Good. Well, we introduced you. Good morning. Glad you could be with us. Well, I'm excited to get our conversation started this morning. And I want to just start with you, Diana, and then go to you, Cheryl, and then Jamie, to share a little bit about your organizations and the populations that you serve and how those populations are currently being impacted by COVID-19.
Well, I work with Preemptive Love, and we exist to end war. We work with refugee populations in Iraq and Syria, and now Mexico on the US-Mexico border, and also Venezuela. And we believe we can end war and create peace by showing up with relief and then creating jobs that actually last, that create a sustainable future for people whose lives are interrupted by violence and war. And as we know, economic distress. These are things happening, but they especially hit refugee populations the hardest. So COVID-19 has been devastating for our refugee friends in Iraq and Syria. And Chrissy, did you say why COVID-19?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so one of the things is that social distancing is such a privilege, and that our refugee friends in Syrian refugee camps, they have such proximity. They cannot social distance. They are living in tiny places with a lot of people. And the second reason it's hit them so hard is policing. They are seen as others in their community. And whenever communities start to get a little scared about resources or sickness, they tend to really start to push against who's us and who are outsiders. And so their camps has been locked down, and they're day laborers. So they need to leave the camp to work, and they get paid in cash. And at the end of the day, they can buy food and feed their family. So without being policed so tightly, we've gotten calls where the camp manager is like, nobody can leave. And if they can't leave to earn cash, then nobody will eat. And it's not just one family, it's the entire community. And then the last reason why it's hit them so hard is Prime. And I mean like Amazon Prime. This is how a lot of people are making things work, is that we work on credit. We don't have to have cash right in order to buy food for our families. And so refugees are day laborers, and they have no access. Nobody will give them something without them having the full amount of cash on hand. So those are just three significant reasons why COVID-19 has taken their existence and really hit them so hard that my organization is working. Our goal is that no one dies of starvation in quarantine.
Thanks for that. Yeah, those are important things for people to understand. Cheryl, how about with the population you serve at Children of the Nations?
Yeah, so Diana, my organization is very similar to yours. So we serve a population of children in some of the most desperate countries in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Caribbean. And we work with people who live in villages where $1.25 a day is what their normal income is. And so COVID-19 really has impacted in the same way that you're seeing the impact. Our families say if we have COVID-19, we may live for a month, but if we have hunger, we're going to be gone in 7 days. Mm-hmm. And so hunger is the option to COVID-19. And so many of our communities have struggled with shelter in place, which when you tell a community in Africa to shelter in place, that's almost impossible when I have to get up every day and I have to go to the market to get my daily food. I don't have refrigeration, so I can't, I don't have the access that I do in the United States where I can actually take my food, put it in the refrigerator and live off of that for 30 days. They're on a day-by-day basis as far as getting their daily bread. And so very similar to what you're suffering with the refugee camps, our families just can't make it without with sheltering in place. That's just not even a common philosophy. And so we have had to bring in resources and supplies and supplements, but those are temporary. The other thing is when you're working for an organization where we serve only a small portion of the population, it's really difficult to bring food and services in just for some families because then you set them up to be targets for theft and other things. And you have to remember, too, that in our countries, they still are going through the normal challenges that they have on top of COVID-19. For example, in Malawi, they're in the middle of a very political, divisive election right now. And so how people are getting out to go and vote when they're in shelter in place just adds so much complication. So those are some really tough issues that we're dealing with as far as COVID-19 and how it's impacting the communities that we work with.
Yeah. Jamie, I know you're a little bit different, although not incredibly so. Your populations that you serve are primarily here in the United States. How is COVID-19 impacting that community? And first, talk a little bit about the people that Circles USA serves.
Thank you, Christy. I'm honored to be in this community here today. So Circles USA is a national nonprofit working in the US and Canada, supporting families to move out of poverty and removing the barriers that stand in the way. And 79% of those we serve are female-led households. And we know that in the pandemic, they have more demands in terms of caring and are more likely to lose their jobs. 25% in our network are seniors over 50 who, before the pandemic, had increased economic hardship and social isolation. Many of our participants have already had adverse childhood experiences, and so the stress and trauma of day-to-day living with the intensity of this stress is difficult. And of course, many of our participants are the essential workers that are on the front lines of maintaining the essential businesses in North America, and yet their wages aren't at a livable level, and they are lacking health care and paid time off. But to respond to the pandemic, we have 70 locations, and they've been serving as infrastructure to communities to organize mutual aid. And so we've been supporting our chapters to organize local laptop donations, to troubleshoot. So families can continue with distance learning and homeschooling. Even we have people encouraging each other to try to save their stimulus checks to be able to make it through an extended period of this pandemic. And so we've been heartened that weekly meetings among our chapters have been able to continue to foster that belonging in community and to talk about how to address the systemic change that will be needed.
Wow. Well, so much that we need to still do, both here in the U.S. and around the world. And I'm glad that you guys are sharing this with our audience. And I'd like to move into some policy. Not that I want to stay there long, but I think that's important to talk about. And so I wanted to bring up the kind of the new policies that we're seeing being put in place, both here in the U.S. and around the world. Legislation like the CARE Act, the Payroll Protection Program, with rollouts, both of those rollouts having their own unintended consequences, both positively and negatively, but then also foreign policy decisions that are being made by this administration and many others around the world, including limitations to World Health Organization funding. From your perspectives, and as you're in contact even with your populations and the people on the ground in your organizations, what are some of the lessons that we're learning right now in terms of how policies impact vulnerable populations who often have no voice and no opportunity to influence those decisions? And what are we overlooking, or have we overlooked in the past that is being spotlighted now? Jamie, if you want to start, because I know this is in some ways more of a domestic issue, but certainly not exclusively so.
The pandemic is exposing the poverty, frankly, that was already there before this crisis. And now, of course, it's being heightened. But before the crisis, 140 million Americans could not handle a $400 emergency. And so you can imagine now, with job loss and unemployment, the struggle that is happening. And as we look back at our history with the war on poverty, for 55 years, we've been seeing a consistently high poverty rate at 11% maintained. So as I look to new policies, I'm hoping this is our generation's moment where we repair our social safety net, because presently the interventions that we're offering our families are complicated and ineffective and random. An example is the cliff effect, where often people lose their benefits at a rate faster than they can earn money to cover those services. And so at Circles, we call this the poverty management system, that we're just managing the symptoms of poverty and not treating the root causes. And so as we're looking to COVID recovery, it's wonderful that we've got emergency relief for crisis intervention and stabilization, but we're really tracking if we're going to create an integrated approach to link that to workforce development, workforce placement, and advancement, so we can actually dismantle the poverty reduction system and put in place dismantle the poverty management system and put in place a true poverty reduction system.
Cheryl, how about any foreign policy impacts or just domestic policy impacts in the countries that where cotton is active right now?
Yeah, I think the same thing. One of the things that I do at COTN is I'm responsible for sustainability, and this has been one of the biggest challenges. I think, as Jamie said, when we see these crises hit, what it exposes are things like very poor healthcare systems, lack of education in countries, lack of sanitation and hygiene. Because those things are already existing, when this type of a pandemic hits a country like in sub-Saharan Africa that's already suffering from this type of poverty, those things are just exacerbated and exposed even more. But one of the things that we're really looking at is not just providing a Band-Aid solution for some of these pandemic issues. because that will solve the problem today, but you'll see the same thing happen a year from now. If you remember, a few years ago, we were suffering with Ebola that was spreading throughout Africa, and especially in Western Africa. And what it exposed was that there were no healthcare systems available to be able to solve for some of those problems. And yet today, now that we have a new pandemic, those same healthcare systems are still failing and very frail and fragile. And so one of the things that we focus on is how do we create sustainability, economic sustainability in each of our countries? Because what we really need is for there to be adequate hospital care in each of our countries, for children to be able to have a quality education in each of these countries, for there to be nurses and doctors. I can tell you that in Malawi, there are 400 doctors for 18 million people. So when something like this happens, it's devastating. And the solution temporarily is, yes, we can provide food, we can provide services, but long-term, we have to be able to look at the root cause, look at what is causing the responsiveness that we're not seeing in these countries. Then how do we overcome that? And the solution has to be in the hands of the people. It can't just be policy, and it can't just be outside third-party organizations. We can influence, but the influence we need to have has to be around this idea of sustainability. And it has to come from within the country. The people who live there have to be able to say and advocate for themselves, to be able to say, this is not acceptable, and we need healthcare, we need doctors, we need nurses, we need education, we need clean water in our countries. In order for this, we're going to have these pandemics. It's not like it's not going to happen. We're going to have these turbulent times. The thing is, can we withstand those times? And that is the biggest challenge that we're facing right now. So I agree with Jamie. This is about root cause, and how do we not just walk away when this pandemic is over and say, oh, we avoided that one, so we only lost this many people, and keep moving forward. We have to be able to say, how do we start building up the basic necessities in our countries with our families, reinstill that family model, and sustainability within individual families is what's so important to going forward. So that's what we're looking at COTN.
Yeah, thanks for that. Diana, I know that for the populations that your organization, Preemptive Love, serves, in some ways it's a little bit different because refugees are all over the world and often displaced from the countries that they call home. How is this impacting that population? And what is unique about the refugee population that may be different even from the populations that Children of the Nations and Circles USA serves?
Sure. I love getting to root causes. And I feel like the one thing that COVID-19 has done, which I think it has brought a little bit more connection to each other, because one of the root causes that I think has put refugees in the most vulnerable position they are is violence. Mm-hmm. And when we see violence, we find hunger, starvation, and refugees. So before each conflict, we see violence. And so I think that one of the best things that we can do is we're looking at refugees, one, as whole people with whole lives, but also we're looking at the policy behind how did they get there? And I think one of the best things for me is when I look at my my Iraqi refugee friends. I'm an Iraq war veteran. And so I was part of the policy 17 years ago of what they are now experiencing. And I can see a direct connection from the violence that started 17 years ago when America entered their country. We decimated healthcare systems. And now my Preemptive Love teammate, Ihsan, he's raising his little daughter in a country right now that's experiencing COVID, in a country that has had their healthcare systems bombed out. They've had so much instability and interruption in economics. And for 17 years, they've been waiting since the American invasion for things to get good. And now that generation they're standing vigil saying that we want our future back for our children. You can't spend it anymore. You can't war it away. Whatever country you are, Iraq, Iraq's children needs a future. And so I see direct correlations between, if as Americans, because this is where I live, if we take seriously our policies and we start to connect who's on the end of our violence, I think that we can make changes that will stop the creation of the next refugee flow, because we were in Iraq and then we were in Syria and all these and so one way that we're looking at root causes is violence. And the World Health Organization, they treat disease a certain way with 3 steps. And we think we can treat violence like a disease. And the first thing you do is that you stop the spread. So we want to come in fast with refugee populations that are being affected by these policies and help. And then the second one you do is you protect the vulnerable. So we have to continue to advocate for the same things, Cheryl and Jamie, the things I want in our country and for kids in sub-Saharan Africa. It's the same thing I want for my kids, which I want them to have education, and I want them to have food, and I want them to have healthcare when they're sick. So we can act fast for the vulnerable populations. And lastly, we change the ideas that lead to violence. And I think that right now we're seeing that COVID anywhere is a threat to everyone. And I think that can be a great leverage where we start to connect our policies and the people on the other end of that violence, which oftentimes has turned into refugees, because once violence happens, all the things you need to live are taken away. So you have to go to where there's shelter and food and education for your kids. So I think it's a real positive that we can start to see refugees not as separate and all those poor people, but like, oh, how are we connected in this global community? And one of the things that I learned in the military was you're only as strong as your weakest link. And I think that if we can start to not look at people as problems, but we start to look at ourselves as a community, we'll find our strength and we'll start to build, instead of pushing the problem to the side and being like, oh man, I don't want to hear about Syrian refugees because, we were there and now we weren't there and it looks bad and it's painful to see people like that. If we can start to say, no, we're a community, so how can we change this? I think that we will actually have less violence and we'll have more thriving kids, not just in Iraq and Syria and in America, but we'll see it in Africa too, if we start to see how connected we are and that we have power together when we create communities that are livable for all of us, not just some of us.
Wow. Yeah, Diana, I loved your comment that we need to stop seeing people as the problems and a problem to be solved. I love that. And I think it really shifts the lens through which we see the vulnerable and those in greatest need, oftentimes, of being a part of their own solution, rather than just seeing as being the recipient of the solutions that we develop. And that actually is a great segue. And I open this up to any of you, but it's a segue to our next question, which is thinking about a post-COVID-19 future. So we're here to talk about co-creating a post-COVID-19 future and what that looks like and how we move through this unique moment well, especially as people of faith. And I wonder what, in your opinion, are some of the most critical changes that we as individuals, because I think that's really where it starts, right? Us as individuals, and it's really all that we can truly control. What changes can we start making individually? And then how might that influence the collective response that we have to ensure that the most vulnerable are cared for, but are also included equally in a post-COVID-19 future?
I love this question because this is like the most hopeful thing, that we actually can be co-creators. And I think as people of faith, we believe that there's a good creation and a good and beautiful world that we get to be part of. And I think as you said, being an individual, we can change ourselves, but we will change our communities. So the thing that has been most impactful, I think that we can participate in is proximity. You have to get close to the populations or the people that you don't know. And so that changes everything when people start to show up with refugees, even in the States, and they start to hear their stories and they start to be like, oh, so you were a scientist? You're a scientist? And they're like, yes, I was, just to see each other as whole people who God cares about their whole future just as carefully as he's crafting mine. So I think that proximity, and it's changed when I realized I didn't really know any neighbors who were experiencing homelessness or hunger. And so my family started showing up at a hospitality house where families experiencing homelessness live. And all of a sudden, I got to understand what it's like to do life in these systems. What is it like when one thing happens and all of a sudden a cascade happens? And I feel like when we can get close, then that fear of the other, or what am I going to have to give up? Or what if this doesn't work with how I see the world or how my people think the solution has to be? So I think that proximity takes away fear. And so if we get close, we can start to experience a bit of our poverty of perception. Like, we can only know what we know, but the problem is we think we know a lot more than what we know, because it feels nice to feel like we kind of know how things should go. So I think just getting in relationship with people will build these bridges, and we really do have a poverty of connection. And I think right now people are really scared of somebody who thinks differently. And I always tell people, I'm like, who's your enemy? They're like, oh, I don't have any enemies. And I was like, well, somebody else might think that they're kind of afraid of you. They don't think that you're for their children, or they actually think you make life less safe for them. So I think if we can start to build these connections and get close, like, just show up and listen to people. Don't show up with anything to give. Just show up and know, like, you're here to learn from the people who are actually the experts and what this feels like. And I think that will actually start to co-create a connected community where we each know that the other person's kids matter. And I do think that we want more good than we know. Like, we have a lot of defenses on that because it's scary to have to learn and be around people that don't do life the way you do or don't believe the way you do. But I really believe that if we could co-create anything truly beautiful in this, I really want it to be communities that have a place for us all. So that's one thing that I hope that this generation will be connected to. They'll be more connected to each other than their beliefs and their politics and their faith, than their PTA of just, my kids do this. So that's the good and beautiful co-creation that I think will actually make me feel like a good ancestor. Like, wow, we did something changed.
Yeah.
I would add to what Diana said. I think that was beautiful. I agree with you 100%. And at the forefront of that is people of faith. I really do believe that the church has a responsibility and a voice and a response after COVID-19. And I hear so many churches talking about, I can't wait to get back to normal. And if we haven't learned anything else, read 2 Chronicles, right? And where it talks about the fact that God said, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways and repent, then I will heal their land. And God intentionally said to the church that it is you who have to take the first step in this. And I don't want to see the church just go back to business as usual, because everything Diana said is very true. And I think that the church has to be the first place where that happens. The church has to, as I say, hit the streets and go into the barbershops and the community centers and the hair salons and the homeless shelters and show up there and hear those stories and understand. But I'll also challenge the church to take a different step at the end of this, and that is to become advocates. It's not enough to invite people into your building, into your service to worship with you and not advocate for them at the same time. And so many churches now will talk about, we want diversity, we want people of color, we want people who are poor, we want the homeless, and we want you to come and be part of us. But there still isn't that reciprocal feeling of, we want to be part of you. We want to meet you where you're at and do things that will advocate, like, as Diana said, for your children. So churches have to learn that it's not enough to just bring people into the fold, but you have to understand them well enough and have empathy for them to understand how to advocate for them. So if you're a church in Chicago or in the suburbs and you want to have diversity and you know that the unjust shooting and killing of young Black men is something that's plaguing that community, where's your voice in that? How are you coming alongside and having a voice? It's not enough to invite me to your table for dinner, but you have to be able to feel my pain and then stand with me in that. And that is the biggest challenge that I'm presenting to the church as we come out of this and to people everywhere. It's not enough for us just to write a check and say, I support those young girls in human trafficking down the street. And, I'm going to pray for them. That's a first step. But the second step is to really understand, as we said, what is the root cause of why they're in that situation? And how do I then go to my local congressman, my senator, because I have that voice and I have that access. So how do I leverage the access and the privilege that I have on behalf of other people? That's where I'm hoping we end up. It's one thing to understand that, I have privilege, I have access, I have things that other people don't have. But how can you use that for the benefit of the least of these? And that's what we're challenging the church to right now, is to be actively advocating for change. As Jamie was saying in a lot of the work that she does, how do we change the education system in the United States so that every child has access to a laptop? Right now, kids are at home and having to beg for laptops so they can catch up on their homework. If any child in the United States cannot do their homework at home, then everyone should be advocating for that. If any population of people like African Americans are suffering at a higher level from COVID-19 because of poor health and poor health conditions, we should all be advocating for that to change. That's what the church is supposed to do. Not just write a check and not just say, I understand, but get on the battlefield, because that's what Jesus did. I mean, that's what he did every single day. So as a person of faith, that's how I want to model my life, to say, how do I get out of my place, out of my home, and go advocate with our legislators for change for these people?
So moved.
I just have to say, Cheryl, thank you for speaking that. That is so good. and I do think that challenge needs to be out there, because at the end of the day, we see it across the Bible so many different ways. When the teacher asks Jesus, what must I do to have eternal life? What must I do to have salvation or life with God? Yes. He says two things. And it's not either or. He's like, love God and love your neighbor for yourself. And I think we love that God loves us, but it's intertwined with loving our neighbor as ourselves. And that action, I think that is transformation. And I think that the church has opted out in a pretty significant way. And this is the chance to opt in such a beautiful way.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Diana. I agree.
Echo Cheryl, just the idea of standing in the face of pain. And since we were invited to think individually, I was reminded of being 20 years old and being taken on a trip through my college to India. And it was the first time that I saw global poverty, seeing a train in Mumbai where people were holding on to the outsides. And the tour guide explained that people put their lives at risk to get into the city for work to maintain their families. And I remember when I returned home, I felt so hopeless. And I was in my dorm crying for weeks, really feeling unsure of what to do. But it was mentors that helped me figure out how to change majors so I could get more aligned with social justice, and how to develop my own emotional and spiritual life so I could cope with the pain of the injustice that I was seeing, frankly, from a middle-income background where I had to figure out how to put my own privilege in service to those that were struggling. And so at Circles, I feel so motivated when we help develop toolkits for our chapters to take action. We've been doing a Civic Engagement 101 series, so our chapters can encourage the people. There were 100 million voters, eligible voters, that did not vote in the last election. So how can we encourage our community members to know that their vote matters, to know that even as a 501c3 organization, we can still engage with our policymakers without violating that standing. And then also to speak to Diana's point about proximity, the heart of Circles is about building relationships across lines of difference. And it's been moving that, yes, the people that are supported to move from poverty to stability feel their lives have been changed, but also the middle income and high income volunteers who are their allies to those that we support also feel that their lives have changed. And they speak about how negative misconceptions and stereotypes that they had about poverty coming in have been shattered because of proximity. And then they take that into the business community to raise the poverty IQ of employers who are more attentive to how we can make an economy that works for everybody and build long-term sustainability for our communities after COVID.
Jamie, I wonder if I can just piggyback a little bit even on what Cheryl was saying with the communities that Circles operates in, because I know Circles works a lot with faith communities and partner organizations. And I'm wondering if, kind of in light of this idea of co-creation, if you were speaking to those partners and communities, how would you invite them in a more intentional way into the work that Circles is doing, into kind of caring for the vulnerable and really, as I always say, bringing them along with us? I love, Cheryl, what you were talking about. And, so often, the immediate response is invite them into where we live, kind of our spaces, rather than saying, I want to be a part of your space. And so, Jamie, I wonder if you would have anything that you would recommend or kind of some advice even for those communities.
Sure. So in the model for poverty reduction, the participants are called circle leaders because they're leading their way out of poverty and they're leading their community to tackle the systemic barriers that are standing in the way. So I want to echo the value that we've already heard on this call, that those with the experience of the problem need to be at the forefront of designing the solution. And then with our volunteers, our stance at Circles USA is that we have the capacity as humans to eradicate the condition of poverty. And it's not an issue of finding enough resources. It's not an issue of figuring out what systems to change. The main thing is that we need to align our conviction, and we need to believe as a people that we can and should end poverty. And so I think changing that mindset is the most important thing we can do. And COVID is asking us to fight against individualism and to talk about how we're all in this together and we're all healthier if we each show up from our own perspective to work together on recovery.
Thanks. Wow. I love this conversation. And I think as we think about the future, right? Because right now, this is a very significant moment for reflection, for change, for kind of taking kind of inventory of maybe some of the things that those of us who can leave behind should, and maybe bring in some new practices into the future with us, especially as we're all starting to think about what it looks like as we reopen this country, our communities, but even around the world. And so I wonder, this idea of if we move through this crisis well, and I really do put an emphasis on well, because we can move through it poorly and end up right back where we were before this hit, which would be a wasted moment. I wonder if you all have thought about what a more empathic and redemptive future looks like for both the populations that you serve, but also those of us outside of those populations even, who are going to be responsible for ensuring that the vulnerable and those populations who have been left behind do have an equal footing in that future. Have you thought about what that future looks like, and maybe what can we start doing to see that future?
I can jump in a little bit on the global front. So one of the things that we do, and one of the things that I'm always challenged with, and you guys have probably heard this, is that global poverty can be like $1 billion business. Sometimes our efforts in global poverty, in eradicating global poverty over the last few centuries, has actually caused more harm than good, because we've gone into some countries and we have totally wiped out their fundamental way of learning, of practicing of worship, of their economic base by offering a handout all the time to be able to come in with aid that has disrupted and dismantled many countries. And so as we're looking at this pandemic, one of the things that happened to my organization immediately is that we were no longer able to travel into country. So we're used to sending over 600 very well-meaning people every year around the world to do missions work. And this is what the church has done for a very long time. And it was really interesting to me to realize that God interrupted that all of a sudden. And we, within 2 weeks' notice, had to cancel all of our teams. No one's traveling this year. And we're skeptical about next year. And so the question that we've had to wrestle with is, so what does this mean for us as a global organization if we can't go, if we can't be there? How are we going to have the same or greater impact on the issue of poverty when you can't just ship equipment like you used to, and you can't show up and do even the medical exams that we used to go and do? And so we've had to wrestle with, what is God? God gave us this opportunity over centuries for missions to be able to provide the sustainable platform that we need so that when something like this happens, it would be okay for us not to be there. So I think the thing we're looking at over the next 5 to 10 years is true sustainability. Truly, how are we going to do more training, less giving, do more listening and less activity with our country, so that if and when this happens again and we all of a sudden can't go, that those countries will be okay without our daily support. And that is going to be a huge challenge, I think, not just for my organization, but for many global organizations who have depended on very well-meaning people going in country to see what's happening and then coming back and being big supporters of what we do. How do we change that? How do we change that dynamic in people's hearts to let them know, as my friends at Acton Institute always say, it's great to have a heart for poverty, but you have to have a mind for poverty. And it may not be that we get to go in and do our selfies and our Facebook post and say, look at me here in country, helping the poor children. That may change now. And so what is your real heart for changing countries and for doing the hard work that we do? If you can't go, are you still willing to help? If you can't go, are you still willing to teach and train and maybe do that remotely? And so that's a big wrestle. And I think that's going to be a tremendous issue for most nonprofits, global nonprofits, to wrestle with over the next several years, to realize that we just can't, we may not be able to go anymore. And what does that mean for us? And this definition of eradicating poverty, what does that really look like? It gets back to what Jamie said. It's about education. It's about healthcare systems. If there's quality education, great healthcare systems in those countries, we no longer have a need to go. And can people live with that? Because what you're basically saying is, I no longer need you to go in country. And as a church community, are we willing to lead with that? And now can I turn my interest towards what Jamie's doing right here in the United States and say, I have neighbors, I have kids right here that need help with reading and education and healthcare systems. So maybe I don't have to go across the world anymore to do that when I have that problem right here. So just so many things that I think the church and the missions community is going to wrestle with over the next several years, as this pandemic has really stopped us from our normal routine of business.
And mute myself. I'm wondering, as you are and your organization is having to even rethink perhaps what that kind of on the ground work looks like. And I know in your populations, there's a lot of kind of in-country help and partners that you are working with. What, Dan, what does that look like in terms of things that maybe we, as the general public, both here and around the world, can be thinking about in terms of our own individual actions, how we may be able to even be praying differently, be acting differently, and maybe perhaps adopting some practices that actually helps to solve the problem as opposed to exacerbate it.
Sure, I did miss your very first part because of the mute.
Because I was muted. I was just calling on you, Diana.
Okay, great. I am preaching this weekend, and one of the things that I am going to ask people to do is I'm going to ask them to commit. I'm going to ask 20 people to commit to giving $20 a month because they believe in the most vulnerable's dignity. Because they believe that what bombs and bullets destroys in a minute will take decades to rebuild. And so that means that we go the long haul, we commit. And I know that when I see that little bit of money going out of my account each month, it reminds me that I'm invested in their good and I'm invested in peace. And peace is when everybody's at the table and everybody has what they need to thrive. And so I think our biggest challenge, what I would ask people to, and as an organization, is Americans are really generous unless they're distracted and they're worried there's not enough for themselves. So to our refugee friends in Iraq and Syria, I feel like as Americans, we're now getting a tiny taste of what their daily life is. Is there going to be enough food for my family? Will I have a job to sustain my family? Will there be health care for when I need it? Because we all need it, no matter what. So I feel like it's this time where I'm asking people to look at us and say, most nonprofits took a mega dive because the country that had more just got really scared about insecurity and scarcity. But I think that we have this chance to look at ourselves and say, well, am I willing to commit and be somebody who isn't just going to give when I see the media show the really bad thing that happened? But am I going to be somebody who says, I'm in it for the long haul. I'm in it until those countries and our friends' kids are graduating, not just ones. And I think we have an opportunity to change how we think that says the Middle East is not a problem. We are all in this together, like COVID is teaching us. So that means that, yes, will I work for my community and the kids in my community to have internet and food and healthcare? Yes. But I'm also going to commit to my refugee friends' kids across the ocean for the long haul, because we can't be people of peace when we bop in and out once. And I think that we want to create legacies of self-sacrifice. We want to create legacies of relationship. And my kids, because I'm a veteran, they think that Iraq is this fabled, magical place that they just can't, they're so mad they haven't been able to visit yet. That is not how many adults or kids see Iraq. And I think that's a poverty. I think we're missing relationship. And I don't think we can be fully who God made us to be when we're disconnected, especially from the most vulnerable and those experiencing violence. So I see if we can commit to refugees, then we're committing to the solution. And we're committing ourselves to not just disconnect when we're scared and we're overwhelmed. And I think that that's where transformation happens. And I think there's so much more that we can be and do if we're willing to commit to being part of the thriving together. So it's a challenge because Americans are giving less and they probably will give less. But I also think that it's a tiny amount of people who can change our communities and change our faith communities. And I think right now is the time to be the friend that you would want, which I want a friend who shows up every month. I don't want someone to bop in. And an example of that is I met a Syrian refugee friend a couple years ago. And granted, I've been worried about her. I'm like, oh my gosh, how are you being a mother right now in a Syrian refugee camp? But because we've committed and because we have a relationship, she just reached out yesterday and asked me if I wanted to meet the newest member of her family. And she showed me a picture of her new 3-month-old baby boy. So if we commit, we're going to be able to come close to pain, but we're also going to celebrate. And I think we have a lot to celebrate if we decide to create connection over separation or judgment, or just erasing people's problems because you don't feel like it's connected to you.
Well, we could have this conversation for quite a while. And because it's such an important topic, I know close to all of your hearts, clearly because it's the work you do, close to my heart and the work that we're doing here at Ideos. And so to wrap up, I actually wanted to, and I'll start with you, Jamie, to think about, or to just maybe in a sentence or two, if you had an audience before you and you really wanted to drive home the importance of some aspect, some change that needs to happen in order to have a much more inclusive future, a much more equitable future. And I think in large part, the future that we've all really been called to, kind of this beautiful community that we've been called to. What would you maybe seed in people as kind of I'll give you kind of some options, one change that they could immediately make, something they could do, or even something they could be thinking or praying about in terms of how they can be more proactive in that process?
So the founder of Circle, Scott Miller, has a book called Enough Money, Meaning, and Friends. And so thinking about Diana's point of generous Americans, I think we can have a conversation in our families about what is enough money? How much is enough? And do we have enough meaning and enough friends? And how can we get more involved in our communities?
Thank you. Cheryl, what would you offer?
I think I would offer that in order for us to have human flourishing in any country globally, that we all have to flourish. And that, as Diana said earlier, we're all connected as a chain. And I can't be okay if my neighbor is not okay. And so the one recommendation I would have is for us to become advocates for each other and to make advocacy active and not passive. And that there are things, if you can't advocate for new legislation, then you can advocate for a kid next door who needs a laptop from his school, or whatever we have as our privilege, that we need to sacrifice that at the altar of advocacy and say, whatever privilege I have, I'm going to use it to change somebody's life so that they can also experience human flourishing. So that would be my recommendation.
That's a good one. Diana, you want to bring us home?
Christy, you just have the best questions.
You do. And the best panel, too. You have great ideas. It's been wonderful.
I give full credit to the three of you.
No, these ladies are wonderful.
No, if there's one thing that has changed my life on the battlefield of Iraq, that actually allowed me to live a free life here as a mom and as a neighbor, it's been recognizing my debt to love. A blank check. Like how we've been loved, we loved. And I think we've been told 1,000 reasons why our jurisdiction is kind of small So those people, that's just not mine. That'll be theirs. And I think really trying to ask, like, where is, like, to accept that we have an abundance, an unseen abundance to live our lives through and into. So will we live into an unseen abundance and make that real? And the practical step that I would ask people to do is commit to showing up. So like Cheryl said, move your butt. Go to where other people are, and not just other people, historically marginalized, oppressed, the people who are so targeted by violence. Go to them first. Jesus said to do it, so I'm just going to say to do it too. First in line, go to those who are marginalized and hurting. And so commit to showing up. So locally, go show up with folks and listen to them, because you're going to actually become an advocate, and you're going to learn, and you're going to change, because you can't not be changed when you're in the presence of another human being made by God. Like, you have no choice. It will happen to you. And the second one is make room for the most vulnerable stories of refugees. Like, we all have social media, so make room in your local life to be with those on the margins, so that you can actually start to become all the things that Jamie and Cheryl said. And secondly, make room for refugee stories. That counts, and it matters, and it's a relationship. And when you have a relationship, the people around you know who you care about, and you bring them into the room with you. You are bearing witness. You are standing in the gap. And that is change. And I think that's the highest love we can do, is bring people in the room with us wherever we go. They're with us. We can't not think about what they need and how they're doing.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for your answers. I know I'm inspired and motivated. And I think if there's a takeaway for me, it's from this conversation, is in a period that seems so much about contraction. I think what we're all kind of, our call to action is actually expansion. Expand your community, expand room in your heart, expand room in your home, just expand. Because those are the things that there is no limit to. And so I love this conversation. I thank all three of you for being such an incredible and powerful voice into these spaces. And we'll certainly look forward to keeping up with the work that your organizations are doing and that you're doing individually. Thanks so much again for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christy.
Bye, Christy.
Good to meet you all.
You too,
Bye.
Diana, Jamie. Take care.
Have a great day.
You too.
You too.
I want to thank our guests, Diana Oestreich, Cheryl Cuthbertson, and Jamie Haft, for an inspiring and powerful conversation about how we can all work collectively to make room for the most vulnerable among us. We hope you will continue to join us for the entire Food for Thought series, uploaded weekly on the Ideos YouTube channel. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope to see you back next week.
Thank you for sharing our table today. Tune in next week for another feast of story, hope, and empathy. To stay connected with us throughout the week, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Empathy Table. For updates from your host, extras from guests, and previous episodes, head over to idiosinstitute.com/theempathytable. You can find the Empathy Table video podcast on YouTube and the Ideos website. Audio is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review our show on Apple Podcasts. Like, subscribe, and share. And while we've set the table, it wouldn't be complete without you, our listeners. Email us at theempathytable@idiosinstitute.com with thoughts on the show or your stories of empathy and how it has impacted your life. Thanks for tuning in. Come back next week. We'll save you a seat.